डिस्कोर्सको सिरिज परेको छ। यो कर्णाली डिस्कोर्स सोसाइटी र मार्टिन चौधरीको संयुक्त प्रस्तुति। त्यसमा चाहिँ सम्वर्धनको सीमा र दोहनको दशामा कर्णालीका जडीबुटी भन्ने विषयमा एन बहादुर शाही जो सांसद हुनुहुन्छ र पहिला अहिले मन्त्री हुनुहुन्छ, वन तथा वातावरण मन्त्रालयको मन्त्री पनि हुनुहुन्छ, नेपाल सरकार। अनि त्यसपछि उत्तम बाबु श्रेष्ठ जो चाहिँ वनस्पतिविद हुनुहुन्छ, उहाँको प्रेजेन्टेसन हुँदैछ। त्यसपछि अर्को रिसर्च सिरिजमा 13 जुलाईमा अ पिपुल्स हिस्टोरियन कर्पोरेट टेकओभर एन्ड वर्ल्डली विङ्गर स्टोरिज फर सोसियल साइन्स अफ स्पोर्ट इन नेपाल भन्ने विषयमा एन्ड्रु नेल्सन जो चाहिँ युनिभर्सिटी अफ नर्थ टेक्ससको प्रोफेसर हुनुहुन्छ, उहाँको प्रस्तुति रहनेछ। त्यसपछि 20 जुलाईमा चाहिँ यहाँ एउटा 15 जुलाईको मिस भएर रहेछ। 15 जुलाईमा डेमोक्रेसी डायलगै हो। त्यसमा चाहिँ अब हामीले यो पटक चाहिँ इन्द्र अधिकारी जो सोसल पोलिटिकल साइन्टिस्ट हुनुहुन्छ, पोलिटिकल एनालिस्ट हुनुहुन्छ, उहाँले अहिलेको राजनीतिक दलहरूको लोकतन्त्रको कसीमा राजनीतिक दल र संस्कार भन्ने विषयमा बोल्दै हुनुहुन्छ। त्यसपछि आइतबार चाहिँ 20 जुलाईमा टिचिङ रिसर्च इन द आर्ट्स अ कन्भर्सेसन बिट्विन टु एडुकेटर्स भन्ने विषयमा प्रणव मानसिंह र अमिना सिंहजी जो दुवै काठमाडौँ युनिभर्सिटीका हुनुहुन्छ, उहाँहरू दुईटाको कन्भर्सेसन हुँदैछ। आजको छलफल कुरा गर्नुभन्दा सुरु गर्न अगाडि लेट्स ह्याभ अ इन्ट्रोडक्सन, ब्रिफ इन्ट्रोडक्सन। आई विल स्टार्ट विथ myself. I am Shekhar Parajali, associated to Democracy Research Center, Nepal.
Namaste, I am Uncle Alcharane. I am also associated with DRC.
Namaste, sir. I am Gaurav Gansane. I have a PhD in policy and I teach.
Namaste, sir. My name is Singh. I am doing my PhD from Hong Kong in Technology.
Namaste, my name is Pratush. I work here. Namaste, my name is Deepak Pogrel. I speak English from the I am Deepak Pogrel. Professionally, I am a political columnist. At present, I write for English newspaper called People's Review. It is published every Thursday, so I contribute on political issues, especially related with democracy.
Namaste, Bachidana.
Namaste, I am Pranav Parekh.
Namaste, I am Anusha Dattaran. I am an undergraduate. Namaste, I am Luciana Shrestha, student of social science. I work here at Martin.
My name is Sanjina Muktan. I also work at Martin.
Namaste, I am Kathmandu.
I'll introduce today's speaker. So Vegard Iversen has PhD. He has done PhD from University of Cambridge. Currently, he is professor of development economics and head of the Livelihoods and Institutions Department at the Natural Resource Institute, University of Greenwich. Vegard returned to UK from working 12 years in India, and then he worked on survey and experimental data to study politicians, voters, and local democracy in low-income settings like India and Brazil. Including his research includes who gets elected for office and how to measure politicians' quality and whether time in office changes being male or female. He has written many articles in reputed journals. Two of those were awarded best article awards they received, and then he was the editor-in-chief of a journal called the Asian Development, South Asian Development, and currently he is also an editorial board member of Journal of Development Studies. Now, so time is Vegard, so go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. You can hear me, or it's fine? Yeah, right. Okay, thank you very much to Shekhar and Democracy Research Center Nepal and Martin Chautari for organizing this talk. I'm feeling very privileged to be here, and I look forward to what I hope will be a rather lively discussion on the topic I think all of us care about deeply also. So I'll call this talk The State of Democracy, Some Lessons from Research on Politicians. It will mainly be based on work that I've done in India. Obviously the context there is different from the context here, but I do think there are many sort of questions and insights from the Indian context that you can sort of will feel is relevant and that you can engage with. The plan for the future is to expand geographically and also thematically to also include work on Nepal and democracy here, and that's one of the reasons for this visit. So without any further ado, let's get going here. And first, introduce you to the other people who've been working on this this project, and also who sort of obviously been involved in developing this presentation. So this joint work with three people: Amanish, who's based at University of Auckland; Pushkar, who's based at Monash in Australia. These guys are both sort of behavioural experimentalists in economics, so they're very good on that side. And it's Francesca Jensenius, who's at the University of Oslo. She's a political scientist who's done remarkable work on Indian data, and is a very, very promising scholar. All right, so for those of you who want to sort of engage a little bit more with the material that I'm going to present here, there are a couple of very recent publications. These are both open access. So when you go home after this talk, and if you're interested in sort of more detail, you can dig them out on the internet and you can download them for free. So one is in American Journal of Political Science. It's called The Time in Office and the Changing Gender Gap in Dishonesty. And the second one is just come out in British Journal of Political Science, and it's called Selecting the Best, Competing Dimensions of Politician Quality in the Developing World. Right, the starting point for democracy is that we are in a bit of an awkward moment. Global trends of democratic backsliding, autocratization, as work from the Vegard Institute shows, and these annual reports also show. Perhaps hard to anticipate pre-Trump 1.0, although US backlash has really strong, compelling historical roots, which you can learn more about if you read Kagan's 2024 book. Recent research in econ and political science has added depth, breadth, and momentum to the study of politicians, and that's what I'm going to engage with here. There's a seminal paper by Dalbo et al. 2017 in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I shall find it useful here to distinguish between the assemblage of large secondary data sets, which they do, to examine specifically the quality of politicians, and studies that involve real-world politician participants, which is what we've done, and some other folks have done recently as well, with that reference there. There's also been parallel interesting efforts to identify voter preference for relevant, desirable politician attributes. Valgason et al. 2024 with data from 7 democracies. So in terms of my objective and approach here, so what I'll try to do is to provide a selective overview of this emerging body of research on politicians. More specifically, and as this title then hints at, can this research add value to and inform efforts to understand and assess the state of democracy? So this is it's a bold objective. I may not entirely be able to convince you, we shall see that as we move forward. But I do think there are some essential insights. The starting point here is that while we can access the comprehensive and very useful VDEM stats and data sets, these tend to represent very broad aggregates. Hence, and rather than then considering changes in large issues such as freedom of expression, toxic polarization, and spread of that disinformation for political ends, which VDEM does, and does very well. The aim here is to sketch an approach, or perhaps a tool if you like, for assessing and monitoring democratic institutions, so institutions rather than democracy overall, including some insights perhaps on their resilience. So the sort of The theoretical entry point here and the empirical one too is to try to think about the issue of politician equality, which is a key concept. So the claim I'm going to make here to start with is that the quality of politicians and elected representatives matter for a number of issues we care about. So these include, but are not limited to, policy priorities and implementation, so delivery performance, the legitimacy of the state, and also, as the title hints at, the state of democracy. But there is a but here, and sort of a big catch, because conceptualizing and measuring, or trying to measure politician equality convincingly, is not easy. These are very challenging tasks. And until quite recently, and both in sort of econ and political science, this measurement, efforts to measure politician equality, typically relied on clearly relevant, but also very causally focused. Yeah? So you had sort of a typical stat that you use for this purpose is level of education or educational attainment, political or other relevant experience that may sort of equip people better for political office. And then in econ, as always, there's a sort of overemphasis on earnings and income capacity, so that sort of features here too. So this sort of limited remit of this literature until recently is not by choice and design. It's simply driven by the fact that data and information on politicians is very hard to get to. So there are clear sort of data and information constraints. So, in terms of progress in this field, there's been some very interesting recent data and measurement progress, and I put sort of in so-called advanced democracies. 10 years ago, we might perhaps have talked about advanced democracies with legitimacy. Nowadays, the question about what is advanced or not is much more up for debate for reasons that we're all aware of. So, what these folks did, Dudley et al., was to assemble a large and in-depth data set on Swedish politicians and citizens that also included measures of individual ability, so cognitive capacity of a certain kind, and leadership skills. The starting point, though, is the question, who becomes a politician or who opts for a political career? And here there's some theoretical ambiguity. The point here is that those who self-select into politics might be doing that for a number of reasons, and there might be sort of some monetary awards or rewards or returns related to holding political office in some parts of the world. But there may also be non-monetary returns related to sort of benefits and feeling good about trying to make a difference, trying to move society forward and so forth. And other more sound motivations of that kind. Rent-seeking opportunities, so the prospects for making money on the side, put simply, are expected to matter, but they clearly are affected by institutional checks and balances. So if you have sort of good checks and balances in place, you're not going to do particularly well if you're motivated by rent-seeking prospects. So against this theoretical ambiguity backdrop, what does the evidence show us? So the recent evidence from these, again, so-called advanced democracies points to strong positive selection into office. Right? So the Dudley et al. Again, compared to the voting population, elected representatives are positively selected on education and earning capacity, but also on personal ability and leadership skills. So this is Swedish data, remember? So they find that Swedish democracy is very strongly meritocratic. Interestingly also, this positive selection intensified, so it becomes stronger as you move upwards from municipal towards parliamentary elections. So if you look at the difference between the average politician at different levels and the voting population, the sort of the skill sets and qualities of the average politician is highest at the upper tier in parliament, and then still higher at sort of lower tiers, but it sort of intensifies as you move upward. So that's really interesting insight. So equally important here, so not only did they find Swedish democracy to be meritocratic, but they also found it to be inclusive, and important for anyone who thinks about inclusivity and possible downsides to that. They found very limited trade-offs between the broadening of representation and the quality of office holders. So, of course, in the South Asian context, there's a lot of questions related to political reservations, quotas, and how that affects selection into office, and some concerns initially about the possibility that, or you know, some sort of sweeping claims about people being quoted in or reserved in, not having the skills necessary, not being prepared to do a good job, and so forth. But this evidence from Sweden suggests that such trade-offs in that context at least are quite limited. Similar subsequent work from Finland, with again very rich data, and to some extent also for Denmark, so very Scandinavian all this, but interesting nevertheless. So what about low and middle income country politicians? As you can imagine, the empirical research here on politician quality is more limited, but is on the rise. And data limitations, if they are constrained elsewhere, there's certainly a constraint here, and there's no shortage of stereotypes. So here is the main stereotype for you, and the sort of the point here is of course strongly suggestive of some basic integrity shortfalls. So if you look at the research here, which sort of aligns with this particular agenda I'm talking about here, most of this research is focused on India and Brazil. There's some work on Nepal too, but some problematics related to that I'm not going to get too much into here. So what do we know about politicians in the world's largest democracy? We know that those in higher democratic tiers typically are wealthy, they typically are very well educated, so no sort of shortage of educational attainment. They're also likely to have family relations to other politicians, former political leaders, so some dynastic tendencies. If we look at Scandinavia, that's common there too, so there's nothing particular about that necessarily. What we do find also, or what has also been found, is that average annual asset growth rate among state-level election winners, so these are MLAs, so members of the legislative assemblies at state level, significantly higher than among the runners-up, so these people, they become richer while in office. Equally important, or more important, a non-trivial percentage of Indian MPs, and this is independent of their party affiliation, have pending charges, criminal charges, often of a very serious kind. So there's sort of some serious issues there around criminalization of politics in India, which Milan Vaishnav has written very insightfully about. So if I'm going to try to sum up a little bit of what we've said so far. So limited evidence better suggests higher tier negative selection on some key characteristics, wealth, criminal records, same politicians seemingly positive selected on other key characteristics. So what we have here, which is a little different from what I talked about in the Scandinavian context, is that you get some trade-offs here, right? So you have, on the one hand, you have these sort of educational skills and attainments, but you also have some downsides that results in trade-off. So all positives do not go together here. And of course, if we look across the pond, the Atlantic, you might sort of see a similar picture there, really. Question here also is whether there's selection on some negative characteristics, or whether these observations are merely reflections of society. And to look into that more carefully, you need to also have a sample of citizen voters to compare with. There are some other important questions here, and this one is, I think, one we can engage with afterwards, and there might be some good insights here too to talk about. So, is selection on negative characteristics less pronounced in other, and specifically lower democratic tiers, where rent-seeking opportunities are less pronounced, or perhaps because accountability mechanisms are more in the face of people because the politicians are nearby? Can the quality of politicians really be convincingly measured? Is this a sort of a good route to try to go down? If so, do measurement choices, that's both the methodological approaches that we use, and which dimensions of quality we choose to focus on, make a difference to the conclusions that we arrive at. Against this backdrop, how can we think about and capture politician quality in ways that are also relevant for assessing both the state of democracy and perhaps also democratic institutional resilience? So what's different in what we try to do compared to what others have done? In economics, and there is some attempted work there on politician quality emerging, but these existing studies on low and middle income countries have focused only on competence. It's this data constraint that I'm alluded to earlier, which kicks in very strongly here. And this is often measured by education or experience. The advantage here of using such simple measures is that they facilitate the use of large data sets. So you can aim for some kind of representativity, but the problem with that is that there's a lot of nuance that you're not going to be able to capture. And as we've seen in the Indian contest, if you look at the higher tier, being well educated or being more educated doesn't necessarily mean that you're more fit for political office, simply because there's a lot of other side things to these guys that you simply don't pick up if you only look at and make comparisons of their educational achievements. Crucial and conceptual, what are and how can we credibly measure desirable qualities in the politician? And what we try to do, which is novel here, is to combine individual surveys of politicians with data from behavioral experiments where politicians were also participants. So this is tricky stuff methodologically, but it's doable. Okay, so what we try to do here, and this is from this British Journal of Political Science paper that you can look at later if you want to have a more in-depth understanding. So we look at 3 dimensions of politician quality here, and then we also bring in descriptive representations, so inclusiveness if you want. So the first one is competence, and then we also look at integrity, but we also consider very carefully motivation. Motivation for office holding. If newly elected reps are seriously driven and with a sound drive, then that's something that shouldn't be dismissed or discounted. It's pretty important in our opinion. So on the competence side, what we do is to use some orthodox measure or standard measures. So we include educational attainment, not saying that that's not important, but it needs to be looked at against other pieces of information. We're also able to do proper cognitive ability tests. So we do that using so-called Raven's tests, which are well validated for low-income context as well. And the strength that they have, at least that's the claim that accompany them, is that they're neutral to a person's educational exposure. So performance on the test should not depend on your level of education. Yeah, so that's why it's a plausible and the best measure for this particular context. We also bring in occupational experience that people might have, or relevant occupational background that may strengthen your preparedness for office. And then we ask some very basic questions about political knowledge, because it's clearly better to know something about politics than to know very little, even though what we do here is not really doing justice to that topic. The next dimension we look at here is integrity, which we also, of course, think is really important. We try to capture integrity through these behavioral experiments. So we use very standard experimental approaches here. So the first one is dictator game, which attempts to measure altruism. Then there's a public goods game, which captures cooperative inclination, which is also potentially really important in a politician. A trust game, which can capture a person's trustworthiness. And then we have a diet testing game, which we use to capture honesty or corruption propensity. And where, again, the external validation is strong for this measure or this game as really capturing honesty or dishonesty quite well. We can talk about a little bit if people have some issues around that later. And then on motivation, we look at self-efficacy. So that has to do with the person's belief in his or her own ability to make a difference, really. I'm going to show you how these look in more. Self-esteem, which is also really important. We know that a number of people from more vulnerable backgrounds come into politics with not too much self-esteem. so that matters too. And then we have questions around trust in politicians and political institutions. There's some really interesting variation, which I'll also show you in a moment. And then aspiration for future political career. On inclusiveness, we address whether you come from politically networked family, land ownership to capture wealth, something about your class background. Religious minority here in this particular context is related to Muslim status, where there are no quotas for Muslims in West Bengal, which we study, and the share of women. So our study location is one district, West Bengal, North 24 Parganas, and we sort of have a sampling strategy where we make comparisons, or sort of we've done everything according to the book on selection and sampling. And all elected members that we have included here are not village council heads, so they're sort of ordinary ward members of Gram Panchayats. This work was done immediately after the 2018 election, so there's no sort of prospects of these people having taken up office yet. So in the politician sample, those who are inexperienced are really inexperienced. They're elected for the first time, and they come in and have not had any time in office. And then there are 48 who are re-elected, which provides for an interesting comparison, and then we have a small citizen sample. Right, so what do we observe here? So this is quite interesting. So some of these things are expected, exactly what you would expect to see. So there are three categories here. So there's citizen one to the left, and then it's the new first-timers in the next bar, and then it's the re-elected politicians in the last bar, right? So in terms of what we observe here for educational attainment, it's as expected. Incoming inexperienced politicians have higher educational attainment than ordinary citizens, and even though the re-elected have slightly higher as well, there's no statistical significance there, partly because it's a small sample. When it comes to relevant occupation, we see that there's a much larger jump, so there's a big difference here between citizens and inexperienced politicians. So if you look at the sort of the occupations that these politicians are in, the type of occupations we capture here is government employment, so private sector, Gram Panchayat employment or contractor, and then zero otherwise. So there's much more of these sort of non-farm employments among the politicians than among the citizens. And we can see that that's strongly significant for the inexperienced versus the citizens. And even though it's higher for the re-elected, it's not significant again for the same reason probably. Now, interestingly, when we measure cognitive ability here, so that's sort of perhaps a little bit surprising, but we find the citizens to be more able on average than the politicians. So there's some selection here on ability that is different from what we've seen elsewhere, but it's still really important. So citizens on average score higher on the cognitive ability test. We also see that there's a difference between the newcomers and those who are re-elected. And finally, on political knowledge, the questions are very simple, so there's no real difference across the board. So on motivations, so if you look at self-efficacy, you can see that there's, again, sort of a huge difference between citizens and inexperienced. A little bit more on re-elected again, but the bars are in the expected direction, strong gap, and statistically significant, similar for self-esteem. Now with the difference also between inexperienced and re-elected. And also when it comes to trust in political institutions. You see that these candidates who come in, not only do they have sort of higher self-efficacy and self-esteem, they also have much more trust in political institutions than ordinary citizens, and that difference is again sort of strongly significant. And also less unexpected, they also have much higher political aspirations. Now, if you look at this a little bit more carefully, so you can see here on the left, the first column here, So you see each of these, the first column is the mean for citizens. So if you have sort of 0.71, it means that 71% of citizens feel that people can trust that I will get things done, right? So that's a very high percentage. And you can see, and to get to the politician difference here, you just add the value here. So for the first category, it's sort of 71% plus 25%, so you get up to 9%. So what you see here is that there's a considerable difference in all these motivational aspects and the self-efficacy aspects as well, and the prospects for people to believe that they can make a difference and have influence over local government decisions, improve living conditions in village, improve quality of public programs, and so forth, with very high scores for politicians. What we also find very interestingly here is that you see that there's again, significant differences across the board for trusted institutions, which we already saw on the bar that I showed you. But also notice the steep decline here across levels of governance, right? So you start at local level, very high level of trust in local politicians, both the sort of, or in the institution, the Gram Panchayat, and the Gram Pradhan, so the sort of the village council head. But then there's a steep decline once you move up to MLA level, and once you move up to, even more so when you move up to national level, and that is across the board and for both citizens and politicians, even though you see that the tapering off is a little less steep among the politicians. So this potentially is really important, we feel, capturing motivation well. If you enter office strongly motivated and a firm belief in the possibility of making a difference, that's something I think we should be quite pleased about. Integrity, so there isn't too much difference here. So dictator game, altruism, nothing really. You see these bars are very similar. The second one, some differences, but they don't come out as significant. So this is some sort of cooperative inclination, contribute to public good. In the right direction though. Trust response, similarly, trustworthiness, not much difference, very marginal difference in those bars. But then on the sort of the honesty task, we see that these politicians come out more honest than the citizens in the sample. And that's again sort of a notable difference between citizens and inexperienced, and nothing much difference there between inexperienced and the elected. And then finally on inclusiveness, so what we observe here, really interesting too, right? So you see sort of massive difference in terms of being from politically networked family. There isn't too much difference there between the inexperienced, the newbies, and the re-elected. In terms of land ownership, you see that the difference is mainly between the re-elected and the others. Yeah, so there's a steep difference there. In terms of Muslim percentage, no difference that's statistically significant. So there's sort of a good representation of Muslims in this district. When it comes to the share of women, interestingly too, so that's sort of higher for inexperience because of the quotas, and some of the women get elected too, but then it shuts down very dramatically for the re-elected. So what do we sort of conclude here? Well, the starting point or the stereotype again, and that's sort of maybe local here, but also elsewhere. Politics is the last resort of scoundrels. Those entering political office here, more educated, more honest, more confident in their ability to make a difference. They also have greater trust in political institutions and leaders. So at least this indicates that local level politicians in the study area positively selected on major but not all important characteristics. Their lower cognitive ability points to a trade-off. Yeah? Measurement choices. So if educational attainment was the main indicator used of competence, which we've seen is common in this literature, and also in research using large data sets that aim to be representatives, we would conclude that politicians are more competent than their constituents. However, when we sort of make this a little bit more nuanced and add these Raven test scores, politicians in the sample have lower cognitive ability and are less competent than ordinary citizens on that dimensions. So how we interpret and measure quality, therefore, matters and makes a difference. To reinforce that argument, this strong positive selection on motivation and important positive selection on integrity also imply then that very major insights on selection would be missed or lost if you only rely on these false indicators of quality. So you're missing a very good and very important chunk of the overall story here if you don't go about this with sufficient care. So, yeah. Trade-offs. So this is really important too, because if you looked at those bars again a little bit more carefully, so we see that there's very strong inclusiveness quality trade-offs, but that's mainly when you compare the newbies, with the re-elected politicians, right? So the quotas, typically what the quotas do for you is to advance inclusiveness and ensure broad representation. But what we seem to be observing here, and there's some caveats here because we're operating on a small scale, there appears to be a very rapid reversal from inclusive towards clearly more traditional elite politics, with more men and more wealthy men and more people from network families. So all qualities then do not go together. Improved measures make it possible to uncover important quality trade-offs that one would otherwise miss. So what we seem to observe here is that we see a partly negative selection on competence, but also positive selection on integrity and on motivation at the lowest tier in India. And for the two first, so competence and integrity, this may easily be reversed as you move up the political status ladder and rent-seeking prospects begin to increase. But given the negative stereotypes about politicians in India and other low and middle-income countries, and the general state of democratic politics elsewhere, our findings then provide a more optimistic account of the intentions and integrity of politicians, at least at the local level. So while these findings need more testing using large representative samples, the in-depth analysis demonstrates, we think, the relevance of nuanced conceptualization and measurement of politician quality. So what's the value added here? Well, evidence on the quality of politician aspirants and elected representatives can provide crucial clues about the state of democracy. As these findings indicate, however, and this is really important, I think as a sort of an attempt to claim from my end here, this state can and is likely to vary across democratic tiers. So specifically, the type of evidence presented here can help assess democratic institutions and provide early warnings of decline. But it's quite possible that what's happening at the grassroots level in terms of the state of democracy might be quite different from what's going on higher up in the system. Yeah, it's not a given that this is sort of an even, uniform across the board process, if there is decline. Yeah? This one I already said. So what is missing here? For assessing democratic institutions and state of democracy across tiers, it is also crucial to document changes in the voting population, right? So are there apparent shifts in so-called advanced democracies imminent or likely to happen also here? So one key question here really is whether particular voter groups or demographics may be more vulnerable to and more likely to be exposed to misinformation. Are we seeing this at the grassroots at the moment? Have we seen it in India recently and sort of as part of the BJP's overall strategy? Definitely, but it's not very well documented. And it's also not very well understood. So I think there's a job to be done here of trying to understand what's going on in voter groups, also in rural context in South Asia, and to do that very well and do that very carefully. Pandey, Khan, and Callan, they've written in Kathmandu Post, asked whether data can strengthen democratic systems. Well, the answer obviously is yes, but they also seem to suggest that young and other voters in Nepal are favorably inclined towards officials and are quite optimistic about the future. I still think there's a lot to be done here too, in trying to understand this sort of local dynamics and what's really happening on the ground. And then there's another question at the end, but I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Vegard. So let's have a question and answer session. So the floor is open. Let's have one-to-one question and answer.
Yeah, you can start. You're welcome to start. Yeah.
There was a slide, and then of course another slide showing the annual system sharing.
Huh? Cheryl.
I wasn't quite clear about
Yeah. Inclusiveness. Yeah. So which one was the?
I wasn't sure what the term.
Yeah. So what we have here, right? So here it's 50-50, right? Citizen sample. It's an even sample. There's some small differences, maybe differences, but overall here in our samples 0.5, right? So inexperienced incoming politicians, 0.58 women share, right? If the quota is 50, you're guaranteed to get a higher than 50% share of women among incoming politicians, because there'll be some who will be elected in seats outside quota system, right? Yeah. And here, what's happening here is that these are the re-elected ones, right? So these stand for open seats, and then this sort of share of women among re-elected politicians just drops very substantially. So if you've been quoted in before, doesn't mean that you know the sort of you're going to be re-elected if you try to stand for election. So the share among the re-elected, you have to then compete for open seats, it's much lower. So that's what happens, right? So you sort of you shift from a more inclusive to more towards a more male-dominated sort of kind of standard elite politics, right? Which also sort of there's also issues around more wealthy backgrounds that you see later. So it's a quick reversal from a sort of an inclusive quota system to the next round of those who sort of stay in politics, where they are much more similar to traditional politics.
So, have I understood this correctly? I said, so they do come into the quota system, but then...
Yeah, initially they do, but then once you've been through a round, you have to compete, right? Yeah. So that's when they sort of typically don't do that sort of things. Right, yes please.
Thank you, Dr. Vegard, for such a wonderful presentation. I really expanded my horizon on democracy, like what is the status of democracy in India. But I have a simple, whether it's a genuine or a stupid question. So like while talking about the surveys, in one of your slides you mentioned that to measure the integrity of politicians, you use experiment. So could you please explain like what kind of experiment was that?
Yeah, so in economics we have a number of behavioral experiments, right? So these are typical sort of experimental games. Yeah? So you have a dictator game. Yeah? So one person has an amount of money, it's given and condoned, and people play with real money because otherwise the behavioral experimentalists will not take this very seriously. Yeah? So for the first one, in the dictator game, say you have so one person is the dictator and the other one is the potential recipient. Yeah? And then the dictator has an amount of money, say 100 rupees, and the dictator can then decide whether to keep all that money him or herself, or share that money with the recipient. Yeah? So there's been a lot of work. I mean, you know, there are sort of numerous, large number of papers and economics written on this. And people mostly do give something, but it's a question about how much they decide to share. And obviously the interesting question for us here is whether there's any difference in this sharing propensity across these different groups of people who were involved in playing it. And we didn't find any difference there, as you will see here. Yeah, so dictator game, nothing. Contributions to public good. So this is a simultaneous vote game. So the typical sort of setup here is that you can invest in the public good, or you can keep everything for yourself. Both players. So whatever you invest in the public good, it's sort of multiplied by 0.5. So there's a return to it. And if both then invest the full amount in the public good, they get the maximum return collectively. Yeah? So this overall pool is then split afterwards after they've both decided how to do it. So again, sort of very well verified, it's credible experimental games. Trust response is a little more complicated, but it's about sort of, again, sharing. You share, there's a sort of tripling of the value of the amount shared. So there's a return to sharing, but then you don't know if the person on the other side is going to return money or not in response to the fact that you both collectively potentially get a substantive dividend here. So it depends on how much that other person then returns in a setup of that kind. Again, very well established. And the final one is this die tossing task, right? So the basic explanation here is that people self-report on a random variable that only they can observe. Yeah. So the way that this works is that people go to a corner, they throw a dice in private 30 times, and then they're going to report back on the number of sixes that they get. And the monetary returns to this depends on the number of sixes that they report, right? So then you can okay, so it's you're throwing 30 times, your expected number of sixes is 5. So anything above that looks potentially problematic. And then of course you have obviously you can't determine at an individual level whether someone is being dishonest here, but you can determine it at a group level to see if the average reporting in a particular group is higher in that particular group, and that's how it works. And it's again, there's been a lot of research here to try to check whether behavior in this game then translates into real world behavior, which is dodgy in a similar kind. And there's some very good evidence to support that also. So the behavioral experiments are experimentalists are very confident about this. Others among us, if you're an anthropologist or others, you can find reasons for why you might want to have a serious conversation about some of this, but it's credible. Yeah. So that's how this is done. So it's quite an elaborate exercise, really, and you have to go about it in very carefully.
Any other comments, questions? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, very interesting,
Yeah, thanks.
very comprehensive presentation. When you talk about inclusiveness,
Yes.
you mentioned one point about land ownership. How do you explain it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So why? Okay, so let's go to this. Huh? So why do we bring in land ownership here, right? So it's an attempt to bring in the class dimension, yeah, because the easiest asset measure in rural areas is land assets. Yeah? So what we see, what we look at here is whether the land distribution among politicians is different, or the average land holding among politicians is different from the average land holding among citizens. Yeah? So if these are similar, then there is no wealth difference here, right? Because you can think you would easily you can easily think about wealth being a distinguishing characteristic for someone going into politics. It's the guys who are rich, or the elite in the village who get elected to political office, and that's what you might expect. What we find here is that there isn't any difference between the incoming ones and the citizens, but there is a difference between the re-elected ones and these others. So that's the interesting thing here, that this class dimension here kicks in when you look at people who continue with a political career. So that's why it's relevant, and that's why it captures inclusiveness and the reversal really of inclusiveness when you compare those who are newly elected and those who get re-elected.
With reference to integrity.
Yeah.
Our situation in Nepal is, you might have studied it, is that unless the Commission for Investigation of Tourism Authority lodges a case in the court, or a Supreme Court itself decides that this person has done fraud practices, there is this is the final point when it is said. Otherwise, there are so many politicians, not only in Nepal, in India also,
Yeah, sure.
representatives
Absolutely.
who are charged, still they are as good as any other
Yeah,
member
yeah.
in the parliament.
Yeah, yeah.
So, how do you interpret this? Because in Europe, Western European countries, there is ombudsman, right? But it is not as aggressive as our. You mean what? What I mean by, you understand what I mean by aggressiveness? That
Yes.
it goes up to the court.
Sure,
But
sure.
in ombudsman does not seem to be doing that. So how do you?
Yeah.
How do you
No,
conclude that freedom is democratic?
Yeah.
Against
So,
Nepal?
yeah, sure. No, it's a very good question. Thank you for that. I'm going to try to answer it. But remember that we sort of democracy is facing challenging times many places at the moment, and sort of the way we used to think about it in Europe, I think, is also changed, partly because of what's happening sort of across the Atlantic. So Milan Vaishnav has a really good account, a very good theoretical account of what he thinks is going on when it comes to people with problematic backgrounds being repeatedly elected for political office. Yeah? So this is something that, there's also very interesting, I think, friction between how economists think about this and how political scientists think about it, because Vaishnav is a political scientist. And the way economists think about it is that it's all about information. So typically what you need to do to prevent these characters from being re-elected is to make sure that the voters are well informed. So you provide information campaigns to voters and provide report cards of these politicians of what they've done, what they haven't done, what they have done well and not so well, and so forth. Inform the voters, and then you expect once the voters have the correct information, they would act accordingly and not vote for these people anymore. So what Vaishnav says is that this is unfortunately not the right way to think about it. So what he suggests instead is that it's among sort of voters, it's often a sort of it can be acceptable to have a representative who is not entirely clean, in the sense that there's a little bit scope for some side payments here and there. We don't worry too much about that, as long as the representative is also effective in promoting our interests and our business. So if you're good at maneuvering the bureaucratic hurdles, other challenges that politicians face, and that comes along with a bit of corruption on the side, we don't care too much about that. And I think in some ways, that's a much more sort of plausible and interesting explanation for probably what is going on when it comes to trying to understand why you have people with problematic records being repeatedly elected for office.
With reference to Sweden,
Huh?
with reference to Sweden, what is it like in the country?
Yeah, so Sweden, I think, the sort of, the interesting thing there is that these data sets, show Sweden to be sort of almost exemplary, but there are lots of political problems in Sweden too, and there's been lots of, more recently, sort of, it hasn't looked that clear-cut as what these data from sort of 20, 25 years ago show. So I think, if you did this again, it might not be quite as sharply clear-cut as these findings I demonstrated, or I showed would be looked at. So probably a bit more problematic there too.
Yeah, go ahead.
Could we go back to the slide about competence? I didn't catch that.
Which one, competence? Yeah.
And because the conclusions at the end are pretty about education competence, do we also, I just wanted to see if we talked about, what did we talk about? Okay, could you just
Yeah, so,
share a bit about that?
okay, so what we have here, yeah? All right. Understand. Okay. So this is sort of standard, right? So it's sort of, essentially it's years of education, right? So the 8.8 average here, 9.9 average here. So that's higher, a little bit higher, 10.4 here. almost statistically significant, but if you had a larger sample, probably you would get difference there too. So difference between the newly elected and the other politicians. Not relevant occupations, you can have a long conversation about what is the relevant occupational experience. But the interesting thing here for us, I think, is that if you look at the occupational background of these different groups of the newly elected politicians and the average citizens, they're very different occupational backgrounds. So that in itself sort of tells you something, right? These people come from other occupational backgrounds than the mainstream, the most common ones, which are sort of rural areas, typically sort of agricultural, right? Sort of agricultural dominated livelihoods. Here it's 0.06, 0.2, who are then in sort of government employment, private, GP, or contractor. So that's different, significantly different, and again, a little bit different. Cognitive ability is this Raven score test. If you want to see what that looks like, I can show you that too. So here's the Raven scores. Yeah? So what you have to do here is to, so this is meant, we can obviously sort of have a conversation around that. So you have to choose among these to figure out what is missing. It's recognizing patterns really and images, and you then have to identify the right one here. And it's not particularly difficult to explain to people what they have to try to do. And obviously everybody gets a test run before you run the test, so they get an understanding of that too. Yeah, and it does have, sort of, here is a sort of a cite from a paper in Science by Anandimani and co-authors who've done similar things. So the Ravens test captures the capacity to think logically and solve problems in novel situations, independent of acquired knowledge. So that's the sort of neutrality to any prior exposure, which is meant to capture, right? And first strength is that they are well suited for measuring cognitive ability in settings where educational attainment is low, with concerns about literacy and numeracy abilities. So that's what I can say. Now back to the competence one. Yeah, so this cognitive ability, so then these guys score higher, so they're more cognitively able. That's a difference from what you see in Sweden. And then there's a difference between the inexperienced and the re-elected ones here too. So that's important. Political knowledge, a little bit more among the re-elected, but these are very basic questions. So you really could do much more on that one. Can clearly be improved. I think even the occupational one you can probably be improve on, but clearly this one can be made much more sophisticated probably to make some distinctions a little bit more pronounced than they are here. It's partly sort of clouded by the fact that we ask very simple questions that most people would be able to answer.
Thanks so much. A quick question on that. I
sure.
See if I missed anything.
No, sure.
Were there some extensions you did not put into the research, but you were thinking about in terms of competence? Something else that would matter, because here we have a very big debate of competence coming up. So
sure.
most of these things are again competence at the
sure.
historically understanding, right?
Sure.
Were there something else that you planned for and left out or something?
I think this sort of, it's always good to have something that relates to, that tries to capture competence more directly related to the tasks that you're going, or the sort of your job description is effectively, right? So if you can sort of have a sharper alignment between how you think about confidence and your job description as an elected rep, that would be nice, but I think there's much more to be done in that space, really. It's unfinished business, yeah. As much as here, really. There's too little research on politicians. But obviously, there are going to be problems as well, because some of these things, if you try to sort of do this very high up in the system, it'll be hard to sort of not see it being gained, really. So one has to think about those challenges too. Yeah, right.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm very curious to learn about, so how do you think about the role of political ideology when you understand like politician qualities or democracy qualities? Because I'm thinking comparisons, like terms such as equality, seems very neutral terms. But you might have like very competent politicians, but with certain political ideology that might not be considered, I don't know, good for democracy. So I'm curious how you think about that. Like,
Yeah, so I think, you know, ideology in politics often come through party affiliation, yeah. So we haven't talked much about political party differences here because there was a bit of a shift between the two rounds in terms of which party was more dominant. So it would have made this exercise a little bit more intricate. Probably for some a little more interesting too, but I think, you know, we've quite managed to stay out of it on this occasion. But obviously, if you want to understand selection properly, you also need to look at how different parties choose to put different types of candidates forward. And the only thing that we have looked at here is also that, remember that the key question is who becomes politician in the first place, right? So we don't have the pool of political aspirants. We have those who get elected for office, those who won elections, and we compare those with citizens. That's different from who becomes politician, because there's obviously a pool of aspirants who may have stood for elections but who lost, yeah, and we are not sort of covered here. And it may also be that, you know, to fully understand selection into sort of standing for elections too, you need to bring in sort of differences in how political parties filter candidates. And there, I think, you know, sort of ideology could kick in quite strongly in that filtering process. Yes.
I guess I have a question towards the democratic institutions which you hinted at we didn't really cover. All of these competence and other things seem very individualized. How does all of this then lead to how you analyze how politics works as a system? System politics, yeah? So how does all of this feed into possibilities of change in the system for more democracy, or more democratic institutions, and all the other things? How does this then work that way?
Yeah, so having information about sort of politicians at large, right, and their characteristics and so forth, for understanding in democratic institutions, whether, you know, it's a village council or otherwise, and at what level you choose to aggregate, I still think it's very important to try to understand changes over time in the attributes of the people who get elected for office. Now, the standard starting point for this in this literature would be that you look at their educational level, and that's end of the game, right? But what we're trying to suggest here is that, you know, if you want to understand this well, you need to at least do better than that. I'm not saying that, you know, what we can do here in a small sample in terms of depth and otherwise, and all the stuff that we can capture is harder to do at the larger scale. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't attempt to do things also at the larger scale, but you may have to compromise a bit on exactly what you are able to capture, but you don't want to sort of compromise too much either, because then it becomes a future exercise. Knowing about the motivation of people who get into politics and having a good understanding of that, their integrity, I think is sort of, you know, what does the integrity of this pool of politicians this year, or this new group of office holders look like compared to what we had last year or in the last election, and discerning trends, really important. Also understanding changes in the voting population and their preferences, and what they've been exposed to and how they respond to what they're being exposed to. So there should be both, for understanding democratic trends and sort of strength of democratic institutions, changes in the voting population, you need to have really good studies of voters too. And that's, of course, it's a big ask, but I think, you know, one should really sort of think about how one can try to do that well. Because in my opinion, at least, these are really crucial questions. I'm not saying that it's easy.
Yeah. But can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
Yeah, sure.
I ask this because there's many political economy analyses in Nepal of local politics, including my political just left, right?
Yeah.
And so the argument there is there has always existed, even if they're newly formed local governments, that these governments come in an old terrain that's already embedded with certain networks of patronage, what have you, yeah? And so when you talk about whether they have integrity or whether they're honest or whether they're competent, it's actually relevant, of course, we can track changes, but it's not that impactful way of measuring the state of democracy because of the formal and informal rules that contour politics, right? And so voters may not vote for someone who's competent, given what you say, blah, 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 because there's other incentives at play, not necessarily linked to, linked also to whether they can bring stuff back to the constituency, but there's a whole network at work. So while this is important, it seems to me clearly important, and it is important to, in one sense, to do that whole genealogy, right? But if you want to understand the strengths and weaknesses of democratic institutions, then perhaps that's not the key thing in a country like Nepal.
So it is, I think, this is precisely the type of conversations I was hoping to provoke, so that's good that you say this. I do think, there are different ways of looking at this, and I think, you have to have a proper conversation about what's feasible, what's most useful, what is the best way of trying to do this, because I do think that it's really important to try to have some early ideas about what's going on, and also what's going on at different levels. Because it's not obvious that the trends, declines, backlashes, other things are the same across the board, far from it. And that is also important, obviously, for understanding issues of resilience and otherwise. But I'm not trying to claim that this is it's a finished story, it's set there and this is how it should be. It's an attempt to engage with, an emerging body of work that I think, if used in the right manner, has something valuable to offer, and that was the whole point.
Quick question.
Yep.
At some point you mentioned about document change in the voting population. Document change in the voting population. And also you talked about exposure to misinformation.
Yeah. So
can you give some example of it?
No. So, all right. So let me just go back to this. Yeah. Right. So if you think about what's going on at the moment, right? There's a lot of echo chambers. There's a lot of other stuff, and there's a lot of even if you look at e-democracy reports, the use of misinformation is it's a political strategy more than it has been for a while. So that's that begs the question of whether certain individual groups or certain groups are more vulnerable or more gullible, which is a bad way to put it, but more vulnerable to this kind of misinformation than others. There's some really good research on assessment of true claims, false claims, veracity of claims. That's really nicely summarized in this papers and proceeding of the National Academy of Sciences, which are the Sultan here, which is there. Which I think it's worth having a look at and thinking about, because I do think this is relevant to politics too. But we don't know enough about what's happening at the rural level. I think in the Indian context, we know that BJP has been doing a lot of very localized work, where ideological statements and other stuff has been quite prominent. And we do need to worry about the prospects of some of the things happening in other contexts too. So if that's going to happen, what can you do about it, and how can you document whether this is happening, and you need to really look at voter preferences very carefully. Even in the UK now, the sense is that the electors become very impatient. You get a new government, and they have 6 months Nothing is, if there's not a revolution in 6 months, they want a new prime minister, they want a new government, and then they want to go to a different party. So there's a lot of stuff going on in water groups that I think we need to understand much better, and that's really important for democracy as well.
The example of Nepal, the election manifestos are put aside, and people start talking about equations between parties, who will become prime minister and who will become speaker. So that's the point I wanted to clear about.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I ask?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you for going into this section. And what I would like to, maybe it may be a little bit after presentation, but I would like to ask, despite having all those good qualities, they seems to having good qualities, but still we see something is lacking, because when they come together while forming political program, there seems something lacking. Personally, I do see something lacking. So maybe are you thinking about some sort of competency that you haven't included in the presentation, or which stops them or which holds them back from forming a good political program and working together and becoming a good politician in real sense?
Yeah, so this is obviously it's a measurement of exercise. It's not, we don't measure outcomes, which is an absolute good point for me to make, right? So you can think of it as an attempt to sort of capture elements or characteristics of these individuals that look good on paper and are measurable. But then the question is whether that really matters for how they perform in office, right? So you need to link it eventually to outcomes too, and see how this sort of changes in these different dimensions of quality then impacts on how people really perform in office, and whether it makes them much more effective than otherwise. So thank you. I think I don't have the answer to sort of how to sort this out. That's a big one, but it's a very good observation for me. Thank you.
Any other last questions or comments? Yeah, okay. Then, do you have anything to join to?
No, I think I've enjoyed it. I think that's a very good question, so that's always nice. I hope there is some food for thought here, and yeah, I mean, we all care about democracy, I think, and it is difficult times. So
yeah, okay, let's conclude these discussions here. So on behalf of Martin Chautari and Democracy Center, I would like to thank you all guys, and then special thanks goes to Vegard. Please do come to other discussions, upcoming discussions of Martin Chautari. Thank you very much.